The setting sun painted long shadows across the weathered porch where Thomas Eagle stood, dark eyes scanning the horizon as they had for decades. The Apache man's shoulders carried the weight of a lifetime of contempt from the nearby town of Clearwater. He'd built his modest homestead far from their whispers and hatred, finding peace in solitude. His calloused hands told stories of survival against all odds, of a man who'd learned to live without welcome, without kindness. When winter storms came, he weathered them alone. When illness struck, he healed himself. When loneliness crept in like the desert cold, he embraced it as his only faithful companion. But could one desperate knock on his door change everything? Would he open his heart to a woman and her children when the world had never opened its heart to him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The howl of wind rattled the cabin's worn shutters as Thomas stoked the dying embers in his stone fireplace. Another storm rolling in from the mountains, just him and the elements, as it had been for 20 years. He just settled into his creaking chair when an unfamiliar sound cut through the wind's moan. A knock, hesitant at first, then more urgent. Thomas froze, weathered hand gripping his rifle. Nobody came to his door, especially not in a storm. The townspeople made their feelings clear. The Apache was to be tolerated, not visited. The knocking persisted. Thomas moved silently to the door, lantern held low. "Who's there?" His voice, rough from disuse. "Please," came a woman's voice, trembling with cold or fear or both. "We need help." Thomas unbolted the door, opening it just enough to reveal a young woman, hair plastered to her pale face. Behind her huddled 3 children, a girl of about 10 clutching the hand of a younger boy, and a bundle wrapped tightly against the woman's chest. "Mrs. Miller?" Thomas recognized her from glimpses in town, where she'd arrived widowed a year prior. "Mr. Eagle." Her eyes held desperate determination rather than the usual fear or disgust. "I wouldn't trouble you, but we've nowhere else to go." The oldest child sneezed violently, and the woman's resolve seemed to crack. "They evicted us," said a woman alone. Her voice broke. Thomas looked past them into the darkening storm, then at the children's shivering forms. Without a word, he opened the door wider. "Come in." They entered hesitantly. Thomas lit a second lantern, illuminating his sparse home, a single room with a sleeping area partitioned by a worn blanket, rough-hewn furniture, shelves of carefully preserved foods and medicines. The woman, Sarah, he recalled, clutched her baby tighter as the older children pressed against her skirts. Thomas gestured to the fire. "Sit, warm yourselves." As they huddled by the flames, Thomas noticed the oil lantern's light, catching in the tears tracking silently down Sarah's cheeks. The little boy stared openly at Thomas's long braided hair and the Apache patterns on his leather vest. "Are you really an Indian?" the boy asked, earning a mortified James from his mother. "Apache," Thomas corrected simply, placing another log on the fire. The oldest girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Emma's cold, Mama," she whispered, though in the cabin's quiet her voice carried. Thomas wordlessly retrieved his only extra blanket, offering it without meeting their eyes. Sarah accepted it with murmured thanks, wrapping it around Emma and James. "The baby?" Thomas nodded toward the bundle. "Lucy. She's just 1. Sarah shifted the blanket slightly to reveal a flushed, sleeping face. Thomas moved to his small kitchen area, putting a pot of water to heat and adding dried meat and vegetables. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackling fire and howling wind. "They said we were immoral," Sarah finally spoke, voice barely audible. "After Richard died, a woman alone with children. The minister's wife spread rumors. Then the landlord found reason." Thomas continued preparing the simple stew, saying nothing. "I tried every house in town," she continued. "Nobody would take us in. They mentioned you lived out here. Said it was," she faltered. "Dangerous," Thomas finished. "The savage's lair." Sarah looked up sharply. "I didn't believe them." Thomas allowed himself a humorless smile. "Yet you came only when desperate." She didn't deny it. Thomas respected that much. He served the stew in mismatched bowls. Children ate hungrily while Sarah managed only small bites. Exhaustion evident in every line of her body. One night, Thomas said, "Storm will pass by morning." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "We'll be gone at first light." Thomas arranged blankets near the fire. "Children sleep here. You take the bed." "I couldn't. Floor suits me fine." He cut her off, gathering his bedroll. Later, after the children's breathing deepened into sleep, Thomas lay awake, disturbed by the unfamiliar sounds of others in his sanctuary. The baby whimpered softly, and he heard Sarah's gentle hushing. Strange how quickly solitude could be broken. By morning they would be gone, and his life would return to its familiar isolation. Thomas told himself this was for the best, even as something long dormant stirred within him, something that remembered what it was to be part of a circle larger than one. Dawn crept through the cabin windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the pale light. Thomas had been awake for hours, uncomfortable with strangers in his space. He moved quietly, stoking the fire and setting water to boil. Sarah stirred first, momentarily confused before remembering where they were. She sat up quickly, smoothing her rumpled dress. "Good morning," she whispered, careful not to wake the children. "I can't thank you enough for storms past," Thomas interrupted, nodding toward the window where sunlight now streamed through. Outside, the world glistened with fresh snow and ice. Thomas stepped onto his porch, surveying the damage. Sarah followed, pulling her thin shawl tighter. "Oh no," she gasped. Her wagon sat half buried in snow, but that wasn't the problem. One wheel had completely collapsed. Wooden spokes splintered beyond recognition. The broken wagon wheel lay partially submerged in mud that had frozen solid overnight. "Axles damaged too," Thomas observed, kneeling to examine it. His calloused fingers traced the fractured wood. Sarah's face fell. "Can it be fixed?" "Yes. Take time though. Parts needed." "How long?" Thomas stood, brushing snow from his hands. "Week. Maybe more." The implications hung between them. Sarah glanced back at the cabin, where her children still slept. "Mr. Eagle, I'd kick Thomas," he said gruffly. "Thomas," she amended. "We have nowhere else to go. If we could stay until the wagon's repaired, I can work. I'm not afraid of hard labor." Thomas studied her. This woman who'd rather throw herself on the mercy of an Apache savage than return to town. What did that say about how they treated her? "Your choice," he finally said. "But people talk. They already do." A flash of bitterness crossed her face. Inside, Emma was helping James with his boots while baby Lucy fussed on the blankets. "Mama, where are we going?" Emma asked, eyes darting nervously to Thomas. "We'll be staying a few more days," Sarah explained, lifting Lucy. "Mr. Eagle's wagon wheel is broken, and he's going to fix it for us." "I'm hungry," James announced, staring openly at Thomas. Thomas silently retrieved cornmeal, mixing it with water and salt. He felt their eyes on him as he worked, unaccustomed to an audience. "Can I help?" Emma asked timidly. Thomas hesitated, then handed her a wooden spoon. "Stir." The girl took to the task with serious concentration. Her brother watched jealously until Thomas handed him a small bucket. "Water from the pump." "Can you manage?" James nodded eagerly, puffing out his small chest. Sarah began folding the blankets they'd used, establishing a silent rhythm of domestic cooperation. After a simple breakfast, Thomas pointed to a door. "Root cellar. Food stored there. Help yourselves when needed." "We won't take advantage," Sarah promised. "I've brought what little we have." She indicated several bundles in their wagon that had stayed dry. Thomas nodded, then gathered tools. "Need to check traps. Be back midday." Alone in the forest, Thomas exhaled deeply. The stillness calmed his unsettled mind. For 20 years his routine had remained unbroken. Rising with the sun, tending his modest garden, hunting, trading, rarely in town where he was tolerated for his furs, but never welcomed. Now 4 strangers inhabited his home, disrupting everything. When he returned with 2 rabbits, he paused at the clearing's edge. Sarah had strung a line between trees, hanging freshly washed clothes and linens. James followed her like a shadow, carrying clothespins. Through the window, he glimpsed Emma sweeping the floor, while Lucy napped in a makeshift basket bed. They'd imposed order on his bachelor existence in mere hours. Inside, the cabin smelled of soap and baking. Sarah had found his flour supply and fashioned a crude bread that now cooled on his table. "We thought to contribute," she explained, misreading his expression. "I hope you don't mind. The children and I tidied up a bit." Thomas looked around at his transformed cabin. The disorder he'd grown accustomed to had been replaced with careful organization. His few books stacked neatly, floor swept clean. "It's fine," he managed, hanging the rabbits to skin later. "Mr. Eagle, Thomas," Sarah began carefully, "I noticed your garden could use attention. I was a farmer's daughter before I was a school teacher. I could help expand it in exchange for our stay." Thomas considered her offer. The garden had always provided just enough for one. Now there were 5 mouths. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "I'll show you." That night, as the family slept, Thomas sat by the fire, turning a piece of wood in his hands. His knife moved methodically, shaving away curls that caught the firelight like copper ribbons. For the first time in decades, his solitude felt not like peace, but like absence. Days settled into a careful rhythm. Thomas rose before dawn, moving quietly through his morning rituals before the others woke. Sarah and the children kept to their side of the cabin, maintaining invisible boundaries that neither party crossed without necessity. Thomas spent his mornings working on the wagon. The damage was worse than he'd initially thought. The axle had split clean through, and the wheel itself was beyond repair. He'd need to carve a new one entirely. James had taken to watching Thomas work, maintaining a cautious distance at first. By the 4th day, he'd inched close enough that Thomas could hear his breathing. "Why do you make the cuts like that?" the boy finally asked, pointing to Thomas's knife work. Thomas glanced up, considering the small face watching him with undisguised curiosity. "Wood has grain. It's like river current. You follow it, not fight it." "Can I try?" Thomas hesitated. Children in town were taught to fear him, kept at a distance by anxious mothers. Yet here was this boy, eyes bright with interest rather than suspicion. "Your mother allow it?" James nodded enthusiastically. "She said I could watch you long as I don't bother. Knife work isn't watching, it's doing." "I won't cut myself," James promised. "Papa taught me whittling before he got sick." Thomas studied the boy's earnest face, then handed him a small piece of wood and his smallest knife. "Show me." James's technique was clumsy, but careful. Thomas watched silently, occasionally adjusting the boy's grip with a wordless touch. They worked side by side as the morning aged, the only sounds their knives against wood and the distant singing of Sarah teaching Emma letters inside. "What are you making?" James eventually asked, pointing to the larger piece in Thomas's hands. Will spoke. Thomas answered, then nodded toward James's creation. "And you?" James frowned at his shapeless lump. "Was trying for a horse. Papa had horse." Thomas set aside his work and selected a fresh piece of cedar wood. With sure strokes, he began shaping it. James watched, transfixed as a small horse emerged from the wood. Thomas's knife moved with practiced precision, revealing the animal hidden within the grain. "Magic," James whispered. Thomas's mouth twitched. "Patience, not magic." When the carving was complete, a small horse with flowing mane and alert ears, Thomas handed it to the wide-eyed boy. "For me?" James breathed. Thomas nodded once. James clutched the wooden horse reverently, running small fingers over its smooth curves. "Thank you," he said, then darted back toward the cabin, eager to show his treasure. Thomas returned to the wagon repairs, ignoring the unfamiliar warmth in his chest. That evening, Sarah approached as Thomas prepared rabbit stew, the now familiar meal stretched with vegetables from his stores. "James showed me the horse," she said quietly. "It's beautiful craftsmanship." Thomas kept his eyes on the pot. "Simple thing. Not to him." Sarah hesitated. "Not to me either. You've been kinder than anyone since Richard died." Before Thomas could respond, Lucy began crying from her makeshift cradle. Sarah hurried to the infant, concern crossing her features as she touched the baby's forehead. "She's burning up," Sarah said, voice tight with fear. Thomas approached, keeping a respectful distance. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded. Thomas gently placed a weathered hand on the infant's brow, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from her skin. "Fever," he confirmed. "How long sick?" "She seemed fussy this morning, but I thought she was just tired." Sarah's voice cracked. "In town we'd call the doctor, but out here—" Thomas moved purposefully to a wooden chest in the corner. From it he withdrew a small deerskin pouch, his medicine bundle containing herbs and remedies passed down through generations. "Medicine," he explained, selecting dried leaves from the pouch. "For fever." Sarah watched anxiously as Thomas crushed the herbs and steeped them in warm water. "Will it help?" "Apache children survive fevers," he offered the small cup. "Give small sips." Sarah cradled Lucy, coaxing the liquid into the feverish child, while Emma and James watched solemnly from their blankets. Thomas retreated to his chair by the fire, continuing his work on the wagon parts, but keeping an eye on the family's vigil. As night deepened, Lucy's fever raged. Sarah paced the cabin floor, singing softly to the whimpering infant. Thomas silently prepared more medicine, placing it within Sarah's reach. Near midnight, exhaustion evident in every line of her body, Sarah sank onto a chair. "What if she doesn't improve?" Thomas studied the worried mother's face. "We wait. Medicine needs time." Sarah asked, meeting his eyes. Thomas looked away, uncomfortable with the sudden connection. "Your child. Your worry. Yet you're still awake, still helping." Thomas had no answer for that. He returned to his carving, the familiar motion of knife against wood, centering him against the strangeness of caring what happened to these people who had invaded his solitude. By morning, Lucy's fever had broken. Thomas found Sarah asleep in the chair, the infant resting peacefully in her arms. Without waking them, he slipped outside to greet the dawn, trying to ignore how his once empty cabin now felt somehow fuller. A week passed with Lucy growing stronger each day. The cabin settled into rhythms previously unknown to Thomas, children's laughter, Sarah's humming as she worked, meals shared around his small table. Though still guarded, Thomas found himself responding to James's endless questions and occasionally correcting Emma's reading when Sarah taught lessons. The wagon repairs progressed slowly. Thomas had carved several new spokes, but still needed proper hardware from town. He'd been avoiding the trip, knowing what awaited him there. "We're running low on flour," Sarah mentioned one morning, "and Lucy needs milk." Thomas nodded, gathering his leather satchel. "Going to town today. I could come with you," Sarah offered. "Help carry things." Thomas shook his head firmly. "Not wise." Sarah's face clouded with understanding. "Because of me being here with you, they'll talk. They talk." "Regardless," Thomas replied, "but seeing is worse than suspecting." He departed before sunrise, hoping to complete his business and return by midday. The 5-mile walk to Clearwater passed quickly, though each step brought increasing tension to his shoulders. The general store bell jangled as Thomas entered. Old man Wilson barely looked up from his ledger, his customary greeting a grunt of acknowledgement. Thomas placed his list on the counter, written in Sarah's neat hand. Wilson's eyebrows rose as he read it. "Buying for an Army Eagle," he commented, noting items Thomas had never purchased before. Children's shoelaces, hair ribbons, milk wagon repairs. Thomas answered, simply ignoring the implied question. Wilson began gathering the supplies, movements deliberate. "Heard the Miller woman and her brood disappeared last week. Sheriff's been asking questions." Thomas remained expressionless. "That's a strange coincidence, you buying children's things." Thomas met the shopkeeper's gaze steadily. "Need anything else to complete my order?" Wilson snorted, but continued collecting items. As he worked, the bell jangled again. Sheriff Dawson entered, followed by Reverend Porter. Both men paused when they spotted Thomas. "Well now," Dawson drawled, approaching the counter. "Haven't seen you in town for a spell, Eagle." Thomas nodded in acknowledgement but said nothing. "Been busy out at your place?" the sheriff pressed. Always work to do. Reverend Porter cleared his throat. We've been concerned about the widow Miller and her children. Disappeared near a week ago after some unfortunate business with her landlord. Town's full of unfortunate business, Thomas replied evenly. The sheriff leaned close. You haven't seen the Miller woman, have you, Eagle? Pretty blonde thing, 3 little ones? Seems you'd notice if such a woman came calling on a lonely man, Reverend Porter added, his implication clear in his tone. Thomas counted out coins for his purchases. Never had visitors before. Why start now? Wilson finished packaging Thomas's supplies. As Thomas gathered them, Sheriff Dawson placed a heavy hand on the bundle. You know, Eagle, harboring a white woman without proper arrangements would be viewed poorly. Might even be considered criminal. Thomas met the sheriff's eyes. Good thing I live alone then. He shouldered past the men, feeling their eyes on his back as he left. Outside, he spotted a notice board with a freshly posted paper, missing Sarah Miller and 3 children. Reward for information. Thomas quickened his pace, the weight of the town's suspicions heavy on his back. At the cabin, he found Sarah had rearranged his living space, creating a small separate sleeping area for the children with a blanket partition. The floor was swept, shelves organized, and a stew bubbled on the stove that smelled better than anything Thomas had cooked in years. You've been busy, he observed, setting down his supplies. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron. Trying to earn our keep, she hesitated, studying his expression. Was it bad? In town? Thomas unpacked the goods, silently for a moment. They're looking for you, Sheriff, Reverend. Questions being asked. Sarah's face paled. Did they suspect? Yes, but no proof. He met her worried gaze. They posted reward notice. Her hands trembled slightly as she continued organizing the supplies. If they find us here, not good. For any of us. Thomas hesitated. Especially not me. Understanding passed between them. The danger was greater for an Apache man harboring a white woman than for her being found with him. We should leave, Sarah whispered, though her voice held no conviction. Thomas surprised himself by saying, no safer place nearby. Woods know me. Town doesn't come here, but they might now, Sarah countered, because of us. Thomas was spared, answering by James rushing in, proudly displaying a collection of pine cones he'd gathered. Look what I found, Mr. Eagle. Can we use them for something? Thomas crouched to the boy's level, examining the pine cones with exaggerated seriousness. Good kindling. Good work. As James beamed under the praise, Thomas caught Sarah watching them, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude and fear. For the first time since their arrival, Thomas realized the danger he'd invited into his carefully constructed isolation, not from them, but from what he might lose when they inevitably left. Emma was the one who discovered it. While helping Sarah organize Thomas's sparse belongings, she found the book tucked between wooden planks in the wall, a hiding place rather than storage. The leather cover was worn smooth with age, its pages yellowed and dog-eared. "Mama, look," she called, holding up her discovery. Sarah took the volume carefully. Wordsworth, she read from the faded spine. Poetry. Thomas entered from outside, arms laden with firewood. He froze when he saw the book in Sarah's hands, his expression suddenly guarded. "Found this behind the wallboard," Sarah explained, offering it back. "I didn't realize you were a reader of poetry." Thomas set down the wood, accepting the book with unusual gentleness. "Not mine to read," he said after a moment. "Gift from someone, long ago." "But you can read?" Sarah asked. Then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't assume." "Yes," Thomas interrupted. "Missionary school." Before they closed it, Sarah's expression brightened with genuine interest. "You had formal education?" Thomas's mouth tightened. 3 years. Until townspeople decided educating Indians was wasteful. He returned the book to its hiding place, but Sarah had already glimpsed something unexpected. A man of depths, beyond the silent, stoic exterior he presented. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah approached Thomas as he worked on a wagon part by the fire. "I was a teacher," she said quietly. "Before I married Richard, I've been teaching Emma and James their letters and figures to keep up their education." She hesitated. "I noticed you listening," Thomas continued his carving, not looking up. "Children should learn." Sarah began carefully. "Would you like to join them for the reading lessons?" Thomas's hand stilled. He regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and something else, perhaps longing. "Know how to read," he said finally, "but perhaps not everything you'd like to," Sarah ventured. "Who could help with that? In exchange for all you've done for us." For several long moments, Thomas was silent. Then, wordlessly, he retrieved the poetry book from its hiding place and handed it to her. Sarah accepted it, understanding the significance of the gesture. "We could start tomorrow," she offered, "after the children's lessons." Thomas nodded once and returned to his work, but something had shifted in the air between them. The next day brought driving rain, keeping everyone indoors. After completing lessons with Emma and James, Sarah motioned Thomas to join her at the table while the children played quietly in their corner. "Shall we?" she asked, opening the Wordsworth volume. Thomas sat across from her, his discomfort evident in his rigid posture. Sarah turned to a page marked with a pressed leaf. "This one seems well loved," she observed. "Would you like to try?" Thomas squinted at the faded text. "I wandered lonely as a cloud," he began haltingly, "that floats on high o'er vales and hills." "Very good," Sarah encouraged. "Continue." As Thomas read, stumbling occasionally over the more complex words, his deep voice gave the familiar poem new resonance. Sarah corrected gently when needed, explaining meanings and context. "Wordsworth wrote about nature," she told him. "He believed in finding the divine in the natural world." "Apache believe the same," Thomas replied, surprising her. "Everything has spirit, mountains, rivers, animals." "That's beautiful," Sarah said sincerely. "Perhaps you could teach us some Apache stories sometime." Thomas looked startled at the suggestion, as if the idea of sharing his culture had never occurred to him or had never been welcomed. From across the room, James called out, "Mr. Eagle, can you show me how to track deer like you promised?" "When rain stops," Thomas answered. "And me?" Emma asked shyly. "Could I learn too?" Thomas glanced at Sarah, who nodded her permission. "Girls can track too," he said simply. That night, for the first time, they shared a meal where conversation flowed naturally. Thomas explained how the stew's roots and herbs were gathered in different seasons, and Sarah described foods from her childhood in Pennsylvania. The children listened, wide-eyed, as Thomas finally relented to their pleas and told an Apache story about how Coyote brought fire to the people. After the children were asleep, Thomas and Sarah continued their reading lesson by the fire. As Thomas struggled through another poem, Sarah noticed how the firelight softened his weathered features. For a moment she glimpsed the young boy he must have been before the world's cruelty hardened him. "You're a good teacher," Thomas said when they finished, his voice low. "You're a good student," Sarah replied, "and a good storyteller." The children were captivated. Thomas stared into the fire. "Been long time since anyone wanted to hear Apache stories." "We want to hear them," Sarah said softly. "If you want to tell them." Their eyes met briefly before Thomas looked away, uncomfortable with the connection yet seemingly unwilling to break it completely. Outside, the rain continued, isolating their small sanctuary from the world that would judge their unlikely friendship. The town council meeting had never been so well attended. Sheriff Dawson stood before the gathered citizens of Clearwater, his expression grave as he tacked a new notice to the meeting hall board. The illustration showed Sarah's face, carefully drawn from a photograph, with smaller sketches of her 3 children beneath. "It's been 2 weeks since the Miller family disappeared," Dawson announced. "This new notice will be distributed to neighboring towns. We're offering $20 for information." Reverend Porter rose from his seat. "Let us speak plainly, Sheriff. Many here suspect where Miss Miller might be found." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "That Indian's place should be searched." "Eagle's always kept to himself," objected Dr. Anderson, the town's elderly physician. never caused trouble. All the more reason to be suspicious, countered Mr. Wilson from the general store. He's been buying unusual supplies, women's things, children's things. That's hardly evidence, Dr. Anderson replied. Besides, Sarah Miller is a grown woman with the right to go where she pleases. Not with children, Reverend Porter's wife interjected sharply. It's immoral, unnatural. A white woman living with an Indian. We don't know that's what happened, Dr. Anderson maintained. Sheriff Dawson raised his hands for silence. I'll form a search party tomorrow. We'll pay Eagle's place a visit. If the Miller woman is there of her own accord, so be it. But those children deserve Christian raising. As the meeting dispersed, Dr. Anderson lingered, studying the notice with troubled eyes. Miles away, Thomas stood in the tree line, watching James attempt to follow deer tracks through the melting snow. The boy had taken to outdoor lessons with surprising aptitude, his natural curiosity making him an eager student. See how the print is deeper on this side, Thomas pointed, tells which way deer turning. James nodded solemnly, committing the knowledge to memory. Mr. Eagle, why don't you live in town with the other people? Thomas stiffened at the unexpected question. Town doesn't want Apache. Why not? The simple question deserved a simple answer, but Thomas had none to give. How to explain generations of hatred to a child? People fear what's different, he finally said. James considered this. That's stupid. You're nicer than most people in town. Thomas felt an unfamiliar warmth at the boy's matter-of-fact assessment. Your mother teach you stupid is impolite word, James grinned. She also says truth is important. Thomas couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. Smart woman. Your mother. They continued their tracking lesson until dusk approached. Returning to the cabin, they found Sarah and Emma preparing dinner while Lucy played with wooden spoons on the floor. We tracked a deer all the way to the creek, James announced proudly. Did you indeed? Sarah smiled, though Thomas noticed the smile didn't reach her eyes. Later, after the children were asleep, Sarah joined Thomas by the fire, where he was mending a broken trap. Thomas, she began quietly, I heard James today asking why you don't live in town. She hesitated. I've been thinking about what we're doing to your life. The danger we've brought to your door. No danger yet, Thomas replied, eyes on his work. But there will be, Sarah insisted. The wagon wheel is nearly repaired. Perhaps it's time we moved on. Found somewhere new, far from here. Thomas's hands stilled. The thought of the cabin returning to silence should have brought relief. Instead, it left a hollow feeling in his chest. Winter still deep, he said. Travel dangerous for children. We've imposed on you long enough. Thomas looked up, meeting her troubled gaze. Not imposition, he said carefully. Sarah studied him, searching for meaning in his sparse words. What is it then? Before Thomas could formulate an answer, a sound outside made them both freeze, hoofbeats approaching. Thomas moved swiftly to the window, peering into the darkness. Ryder, he whispered. Coming fast. Sarah gathered the children's scattered belongings with shaking hands. They've found us. Hide, Thomas instructed, reaching for his rifle. A sharp knock came at the door. Thomas motioned Sarah behind the blanket partition before opening it, rifle ready. Dr. Anderson stood on the porch, alone and breathless. Eagle, he gasped. Thank God you're here. Thomas lowered his weapon slightly. Doctor, they're forming a search party, Anderson said urgently. Sheriff, Reverend, others. Coming tomorrow to look for Sarah and the children. He peered past Thomas. Are they here? Thomas hesitated, but Sarah emerged from hiding. Dr. Anderson, she acknowledged warily. The elderly physician's shoulders sagged in relief. I thought as much. You need to prepare. They've convinced themselves something sinister is happening here. Nothing sinister about shelter, Thomas said flatly. You know that, and I know that, Anderson replied. But they've worked themselves into a frenzy. White woman living with a savage. That's how they're talking. Sarah's face flushed with anger. That's absurd. Thomas has been nothing but honorable. Honorable doesn't matter to frightened, ignorant people, Anderson said gently. I came to warn you, and to bring these. He handed Thomas a bundle. Medicine, food, ammunition, whatever you decide to do, you'll need supplies. Thomas accepted the bundle with a nod of thanks. I should go before I'm missed, the doctor said, turning to leave. Be careful, both of you. After he departed, Sarah and Thomas stood in silence, the weight of decision heavy between them. What will we do? Sarah finally whispered. Thomas stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Your choice. Stay and face them, or leave tonight. Dawn broke with a heavy mist clinging to the trees. Thomas had been awake all night, alternating between keeping watch and preparing for whatever might come. Sarah, too, had slept little, her eyes red-rimmed as she quietly packed and unpacked their meager belongings, indecision evident in every movement. We could reach the next county in 3 days, she said, voice barely above a whisper so as not to wake the children. Start fresh where no one knows us. Thomas tested the repaired wagon wheel, his expression unreadable. Snow still deep in passes. Dangerous with young one. More dangerous to stay, Sarah countered. Before Thomas could respond, a lone rider emerged from the mist. Both tensed until they recognized Dr. Anderson's elderly mare. They're coming, the doctor called as he dismounted, breath fogging in the cold air. Sheriffs gathered 6 men, their meeting at sunrise. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. So soon, I managed to delay them slightly, Anderson explained, removing a large basket from his saddlebag. Told them I needed to check on the Miller farm first, in case she'd returned there. Thomas accepted the basket, larger and heavier than the bundle from last night. Inside lay an assortment of carefully packed items, jars of medicine, dried meat, flour, salt, ammunition for Thomas's rifle, warm socks for the children, and at the bottom, carefully wrapped, a small leather pouch of coins. Everything I could gather without raising suspicion, Anderson explained. Why help us? Thomas asked, the question that had lingered since the doctor's first warning. Anderson's weathered face softened. 20 years ago, Eagle, when that influenza swept through, you brought medicine to my door. Traditional remedies when my Western ones failed. You saved half the town, including my wife, though they'll never admit it. He turned to Sarah. And you, Miller, deserve better than the treatment you've received since Richard's passing. Sarah blinked back tears. The town was my home for 5 years. I never thought they'd turn on me so completely. Fear and prejudice make for poor neighbors. Anderson sighed. What will you do? Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. They hadn't reached a decision. The children are finally settled, Sarah said softly. James follows Thomas everywhere, learning tracking and woodcraft. Emma's reading has improved so much. And Lucy looked toward the cabin where the baby slept peacefully. She's thriving on Thomas's herbal teas. The thought of uprooting them again. If you stay, Anderson warned, you'll face scrutiny. Judgment. Perhaps worse. And if we go, Sarah asked. Winter travel with children is perilous, Thomas interjected. No guarantee of welcome elsewhere. Anderson studied them both. There might be another way. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Sheriff has no legal right to separate you. You've broken no laws. A woman may choose her own company, even if the town disapproves. They'll take my children, Sarah whispered. Call me unfit. Not if you stand your ground, Anderson insisted. I'll speak for you. So will others who remember your late husband fondly. Others? Thomas asked skeptically. Not everyone in Clearwater shares Reverend Porter's views. Anderson assured him. Many remember your help during the epidemic, Thomas, even if they don't acknowledge it publicly. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to touch Thomas's arm. The first such contact between them. Thomas stiffened momentarily, then relaxed, simple gesture somehow more significant than words. If we stay, Sarah said quietly, what happens today when they come? Anderson straightened his shoulders. I'll return to town now, join the search party, direct them away from here initially. Buy you more time, but eventually they'll come. He looked at Thomas. When they do, let me do the talking. Thomas nodded once, understanding. The doctor mounted his horse, then paused. Whatever happens, remember you have at least one friend in town. With that, he rode back into the mist. When he was gone, Sarah turned to Thomas, her eyes searching his face. What do you think we should do? Thomas considered the question carefully. In all his years of isolation, he'd never had someone ask his opinion on a matter so important. Your decision, he finally said. Your children. But it affects you too, Sarah insisted. This is your home. Thomas looked around at the small clearing, the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the forest that had been both his prison and his sanctuary for 20 years. Home, he struggled to find the right words. Home is where safety is. For you. For children. Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the implication. Are you saying we're safe with you? Thomas met her gaze directly. Would protect you. All of you. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Sarah's hand found his again, this time deliberately. Then we stay, she decided, and face them together. Inside the cabin, James called out, awake and hungry. The spell broken, Sarah stepped away. But the decision was made. Thomas moved the basket of supplies inside, its contents representing something he'd never expected to find again. An ally, perhaps even a friend, in a world that had taught him to expect neither. As he prepared for the coming confrontation, Thomas realized with surprise that for the first time in decades, he was no longer fighting solely for his own survival, but for something that felt remarkably like family. The morning unfolded with tense anticipation. Sarah kept the children inside, attempting normalcy through reading lessons and quiet games. Thomas moved methodically around the property, checking sightlines and potential approaches, his rifle never far from reach. By midday, Sarah's nerves had frayed to breaking. While the children napped, she retrieved her best dress. The blue cotton, with tiny white flowers, that had been her Sunday church dress in town. The hem was torn, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, but it was the finest thing she owned. Should look presentable, she explained when Thomas raised an eyebrow. If they're coming to judge me, I won't appear as they expect. She sat by the window, needle flashing in the sunlight as she carefully mended the torn hair. Thomas watched her hands move with practiced precision, remembering his own mother's similar movements from long ago. Will they take us away? Emma's small voice startled them both. She stood in the doorway of the children's sleeping area, eyes wide with fear. Sarah set aside her sewing. Come here, sweetheart. Emma climbed onto her mother's lap, though at 10 she was nearly too big for such comforts. No one is taking you anywhere. This is our home now. Emma glanced at Thomas. With Mr. Eagle too? Sarah hesitated, meeting Thomas's eyes over her daughter's head. Yes, she said finally, with Mr. Eagle too, if that's agreeable to him. Thomas gave a single solemn nod that seemed to satisfy Emma. I like it better here anyway, the girl declared. In town, the other children were mean. They called James a baby and said we were poor. She fingered the soft fabric of her mother's dress. Are we poor, Mama? Sarah resumed her mending, incorporating Emma into the task by letting her hold the thread. We have enough, she answered carefully, and we have each other. Thomas moved to the window, scanning the tree line. A flicker of movement caught his eye. They're coming, he said quietly. Sarah quickly finished the last stitches, hands trembling slightly. She stood, shaking out the freshly mended dress. I need to change. While Sarah dressed, Thomas gathered James and Lucy, settling them at the table with simple wooden toys he'd carved. His mind raced through options: confrontation, evasion, submission. None felt right. Sarah emerged in her blue dress, hair neatly pinned, face composed, though her eyes betrayed her fear. How do I look? She asked, attempting lightness. Like a respectable widow, Thomas answered honestly. Strong mother, A flush colored her cheeks at the simple compliment. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, at least 4 riders by Thomas's count. "Stay inside with children," Thomas instructed, moving to the door. "No," Sarah countered firmly. "We face them together, as we decided." Before Thomas could argue, the riders appeared in the clearing. Sheriff Dawson led the group, followed by Reverend Porter, Wilson from the store, and 2 young deputies. Dr. Anderson rode slightly behind, expression carefully neutral. Thomas stepped onto the porch, positioning himself between the riders and the door. Sarah stood in the doorway, one hand on Emma's shoulder, the other holding Lucy. James pressed against her skirts. "Well now," Sheriff Dawson called, reining his horse. "Seems our search is over before it properly began. Mrs. Miller," Reverend Porter's voice dripped with false concern, "we've been so worried. The entire town has been searching for you and the little ones." Sarah lifted her chin. "As you can see, Reverend, we're perfectly well, in the home of an unmarried man." Mrs. Porter emerged from behind her husband's horse, her presence unexpected. "Alone? Unchaperoned? Mr. Eagle has shown us nothing but Christian charity." Sarah replied evenly. When the town offered none, Sheriff Dawson dismounted, approaching the porch. "That may be, Mrs. Miller, but you must see how this appears. A respectable widow living with," he glanced dismissively at Thomas, "in such arrangements. I see a woman making the best choice for her children." Dr. Anderson interjected, joining them. "After being evicted with nowhere to turn, there were options in town," Reverend Porter's wife insisted. "Were there?" Sarah challenged. "You refused us shelter. The church refused us. My late husband's friends turned their backs. The children belong in proper Christian surroundings," Reverend Porter declared. "Not with a what?" Thomas spoke for the first time, his deep voice silencing the Reverend. "Say it." An uncomfortable silence fell. James broke it, stepping forward defiantly. "Mr. Eagle teaches me tracking and fishing and stories. He made medicine when Lucy was sick. He's good." Sheriff Dawson softened slightly at the boy's defense. "Son, no one's saying he isn't kind in his way, but there are proprieties to consider. The wagon is fixed," Thomas stated flatly. "They can leave when they choose. Their decision to stay." "Is that true, Mrs. Miller?" the sheriff asked. "You're here willingly." "I am," Sarah confirmed. "Mr. Eagle has been a gentleman and a friend when I desperately needed both." Mrs. Porter scoffed. "A gentleman, an Indian savage living alone with a white woman. The scandal is beyond bearing." Thomas's face remained impassive, but Sarah flushed with anger. "I'd rather my children learn from Mr. Eagle's savage dignity than from your Christian cruelty, Mrs. Porter." The Reverend's wife gasped. Sheriff Dawson held up his hands placatingly. "Mrs. Miller, no one's forcing you to leave today, but consider your reputation, your children's future. This situation cannot continue indefinitely." "Why not?" Dr. Anderson challenged. "No law against." "There are laws of decency," Reverend Porter insisted. Sheriff Dawson sighed. "We'll be back, Mrs. Miller, to discuss this properly." He tipped his hat. "Good day to you." As the riders departed, Thomas noticed James watching intently from the porch. "Why didn't you fight them?" the boy asked, when they were alone. "They said bad things." Thomas crouched to the child's level. "Sometimes strongest fight is standing ground, not raising fists." Inside, Sarah sank into a chair, the blue dress now a battle flag rather than a symbol of respectability. "They'll be back," she whispered, "and they'll bring more with them next time." Thomas nodded gravely. The reprieve was temporary, but in it lay something unexpected. The first public defense of his character in 20 years of isolation. The memory of Sarah's fierce words, savage dignity, echoed in his mind, warming places long gone cold. That evening, after the children were asleep, Thomas unfolded a worn leather bundle on the table. Sarah watched as he carefully spread out a hand-drawn map, its edges frayed, the ink faded in places from years of handling. "What is this?" she asked, leaning closer. "Territory map," Thomas explained. "Made it years ago. Shows all safe places, water sources, caves, hunting grounds. Sarah traced the careful illustrations with her fingertip: mountains, rivers, and valleys, rendered with surprising detail. Small symbols marked locations of significance, some in a script she didn't recognize. Apache writing, Thomas said, noting her curiosity. Old symbol. It's beautiful, Sarah murmured. So detailed. Thomas pointed to their current location, a small clearing near a creek bend, marked with a symbol resembling a cabin. We are here. His finger moved across the parchment. Town is here. Next settlement, 30 miles south. Why are you showing me this? Sarah asked. Though she suspected the answer, Thomas met her gaze directly. Sheriff will return, with more men, more authority. You think we should leave after all? Need to know options, Thomas replied pragmatically. He indicated a mountain pass. This route, dangerous now. Snow still deep, but in 3 weeks passable. Sarah studied the map, her expression troubled. And this area here, she pointed to a valley marked with symbols she couldn't decipher. Apache land once, good hunting, fertile soil. A shadow crossed Thomas's face. Army pushed tribe west long ago. Few remain scattered. Your family? Thomas was silent for a moment. Gone. Mother died of white man's disease. Father in mining accident. No brothers, sisters. Sarah's hand covered his briefly, a gesture of shared understanding. My parents died before Emma was born. No siblings either. They sat in companionable silence, united in their isolation. Finally, Sarah spoke again. The wagon is fixed now. We could leave, find somewhere new. She traced possible routes on the map. But where would we go? Another town where we're strangers? Where the children have to start again? Could try the city, Thomas suggested. Denver? More people. Less notice of differences. And you? Sarah asked quietly. Would you come with us? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to voice aloud. My place is here, Thomas said finally. Sarah nodded, unsurprised but visibly disappointed. This is your home, I understand. But, Thomas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Could be your home too, if wanted. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Are you suggesting we stay? Permanently. After today? Winter coming, Thomas pointed out practically. Garden needs planting soon. Children settled. Lucy growing strong. He paused. Never had family before. The word family lingered in the air, carrying meaning beyond its simple syllables. The town won't accept it, Sarah said softly. They made that clear today. Town doesn't decide, Thomas countered with unexpected firmness. We decide. Sarah smiled at his use of we, how naturally it had come to include her, and the children in his case. If we stay, she began thoughtfully, we need a more permanent arrangement, something the town can't easily challenge. Thomas nodded, understanding her meaning. Partnership, for the children's sake. Yes, Sarah agreed, her cheeks coloring slightly. For the children. A business arrangement of sorts. You provide the land and home. I contribute through teaching, gardening, household alignment. Equal shares, Thomas confirmed. Equal say in decisions. Sarah extended her hand formally across the map. Partners then. Thomas hesitated only briefly before taking her hand in his, a simple handshake that somehow felt more binding than any written contract. Need to make it official, he said. Document, for sheriff, for children's protection. I'll write it tomorrow, Sarah agreed. Dr. Anderson could witness it. They fell silent again, both contemplating the step they'd just taken. The map lay between them, no longer showing escape routes, but instead marking the boundaries of their shared future. Thomas, Sarah said hesitantly, thank you for everything. Most men would have sent us away that first night. Not like most men, Thomas said simply. Sarah's smile warmed. No, you're certainly not. Later, as Thomas returned the map to its leather case, he reflected on how differently he viewed the territory now. For 20 years it had been a wilderness to navigate alone, filled with places to hide, to hunt, to survive. Now, with Sarah and the children, the same landscape transformed, becoming a place of potential, of growth, of connection. The map had always shown him where he was. For the first time it showed him where he might be going. Not alone, but with others beside him. The thought was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. Outside, the first flakes of a new snowfall drifted past the window. Winter settling in, urging them to do the same. Thomas added wood to the fire, watching the flames leap higher, casting warm light over Sarah as she prepared for bed. She caught his gaze and smiled, a simple gesture that somehow made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a home. 3 days after Dr. Anderson had witnessed their written agreement, Thomas decided it was time. He retrieved a wooden box from beneath a loose floorboard, one of many hidden caches around his property. The box was simple, unadorned except for faded symbols carved into its lid. Inside, wrapped in softened deerskin, lay his father's hunting knife. The blade, still sharp after decades, bore distinctive markings along the metal. The handle, crafted from elk antler, had been polished by generations of hands. Thomas hadn't touched it in years. Some things were too precious for everyday use, carrying memories too heavy to bear regularly. But now, watching James struggle to gut a rabbit with a dull kitten knife, he recognized the time had come. "Boy," Thomas called, "come here." James approached, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Yes, Mr. Eagle." Thomas unwrapped the knife, holding it flat across both palms. "Belonged to my father, his father before him." James's eyes widened. "It's beautiful. Apache warrior's knife," Thomas explained. "For hunting, protection, survival." He hesitated, then added, "For teaching, son." The implication wasn't lost on James. His small chest swelled as he recognized the honor being offered. "Are you going to teach me to use it?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "Time you learned properly. Winter coming. Need meat stored." From the garden, Sarah watched the exchange, understanding its significance. In the weeks since their agreement, Thomas had begun sharing more of his heritage with the children, stories by firelight, practical skills during daylight hours. This, however, was different. The knife represented lineage, tradition, family. That afternoon, Thomas took James to a clearing behind the cabin. Sarah and Emma worked in the expanded garden, now 3 times its original size. They'd planted hardy winter vegetables, turnips, cabbage, winter squash, following Thomas's guidance on timing and placement. "Mama," Emma said, watching her brother and Thomas from afar, "do you think we'll stay here forever?" Sarah patted down soil around a seedling. "Would you like that?" Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I like how quiet it is, and Mr. Eagle doesn't yell like Papa sometimes did when he drank his medicine." Sarah straightened, surprised by her daughter's observation. "Your father loved us, Emma. He was just in pain sometimes." "I know," Emma replied simply, "but Mr. Eagle is nice all the time, even when he's quiet." In the clearing, Thomas guided James's small hands as they cleaned and preserved the rabbit meat. The boy proved an apt pupil, his natural curiosity making him eager to learn. Thomas showed him how to respect the animal that had given its life, using every part: meat for food, fur for warmth, bones for tools. "Never waste," Thomas instructed, "never kill more than needed." "The boys in town said Indians scalp people," James said suddenly. "Is that true?" Thomas's expression remained unchanged, though something flickered in his eyes. "Some warriors did, long ago, in war." He turned the knife in his hand. "This knife never took human life. My father's promise. My promise too." James absorbed this solemnly. "I promise too." That evening they shared a stew made from the rabbit James had helped prepare. The boy recounted his lessons proudly, showing his sisters the proper way to hold Thomas's knife. "Careful," Sarah cautioned, as Lucy reached for the shiny blade. "Already taught him knife safety," Thomas assured her. "No accidents." Sarah smiled. "I trust you both." After the children were asleep, Thomas and Sarah sat by the fire, the season's first truly cold night keeping them close to the flame. Thomas worked on carving a series of small wooden containers for storing dried herbs, while Sarah mended clothing. "You're good with him," Sarah said quietly. With all of them, but especially James. He needs a man's guidance. Thomas continued his careful carving. Boys quick to learn. Good heart. He adores you, Sarah observed. They all do. Thomas looked up, surprise evident in his usually impassive features. Children adapt easily. It's more than adaptation, Sarah countered gently. It's trust, respect. She hesitated. Love even. Thomas's hands stilled. The word hung between them, neither fully addressing its implications beyond the children. Winter will be harsh, he said finally, changing the subject. Need more meat stored, more firewood split. We'll manage, Sarah assured him. Together. That night, Thomas lay awake, long after Sarah's breathing had deepened into sleep. The cabin felt different now, warmer despite the chill outside, fuller with the soft sounds of the children's slumber. He thought about his father's knife, now carefully stored where James could reach it under supervision. For generations, it had passed from father to son, a symbol of Apache manhood, of responsibility and protection. Thomas had never expected to continue that tradition, had resigned himself to being the last to hold it. Now, watching the boy's eager hands learn its weight and balance, something long dormant stirred in Thomas's heart. Not quite racehood, he wouldn't presume such a sacred role, but something close, mentorship, guardianship, connection. From her bed, Sarah stirred, murmuring something indistinct. Thomas listened to the cadence of her breathing, finding unexpected comfort in its rhythm. Their arrangement remained practical, proper, separate sleeping areas, clear boundaries maintained. Yet something was shifting between them, slow and subtle as the changing seasons. Outside, the first hard frost of winter crystallized on fallen leaves. Inside, something equally transformative was taking hold. A family forming not from blood, but from choice, from necessity that had somehow become desire, from strangers who had somehow become essential to one another. December brought deep snow and early nightfall. The cabin, once sparse and utilitarian, had transformed under Sarah's touch. Neat curtains fashioned from old fabric, children's drawings pinned to walls, orderly shelves of preserved foods. Thomas found himself increasingly comfortable in this softened version of his home, though he'd never admit it aloud. One evening, as Thomas returned from checking his trap lines, he found Sarah and the children huddled in consultation. They fell suspiciously silent at his entrance. "Secret talks?" he asked, brushing snow from his coat. Emma giggled. "It's about Christmas. It's only 2 weeks away." Thomas hung his coat by the fire. "Apache don't celebrate Christmas." "Never." James looked shocked. "But what about presents? And cookies?" "Different traditions," Thomas explained simply. Sarah approached, wiping flour from her hands. "Would it bother you if we celebrated?" "Nothing elaborate. Just a small observance for the children." Thomas considered the hopeful faces watching him. "You're home too now. Your traditions welcome." Sarah's smile warmed him more than the fire. "Thank you. We won't make a fuss." But over the following days, a quiet excitement filled the cabin. Thomas observed with curiosity as Sarah and the children collected pine cones, saved scraps of colored fabric, and fashioned candles from precious beeswax. Thomas had traded for last summer. "What's this?" Thomas asked one evening, finding Emma carefully piercing berries with a needle and thread. "Decorations," she explained. "For Christmas. Mama says we can't buy glass ones like in town, so we're making our own." Thomas watched her small fingers work, admiring her concentration. Without comment, he took out his carving knife and selected several small pieces of pine and cedar wood. The next morning, Sarah discovered tiny wooden stars and crescent moons on the table, each carved with delicate precision, small holes drilled for hanging. "Did you make these?" she asked Thomas, who was teaching James to repair a snowshoe. Thomas nodded once. "For tree, if wanted." Sarah touched the carvings gently. "They're beautiful. Thank you." "Mama, look," James called from where he'd been rummaging in Thomas's storage chest. "With permission. Beads. Can we use these?" He held up a small pouch of colored glass beads, remnants from Thomas's mother's possessions. Thomas had kept them out of sentiment, though they served no practical purpose. "Those are Mr. Eagle's," Sarah reminded her son. "Not ours to use. For decorations," Thomas said, "if careful with them." As Christmas approached, a small pine tree appeared in the corner of the cabin, cut by James under Thomas's supervision. Together, they adorned it with the children's berry strings, Thomas's wooden carvings, and tiny ornaments fashioned from pine cones, fabric scraps, and the glass beads. Sarah contributed paper stars made from pages of a damaged book, carefully preserving the text by folding it artfully. On Christmas Eve, Thomas returned from a final hunting trip with a plump turkey. Seeing Sarah's surprise, he shrugged. Special meal needed for celebration. That night, after a dinner more festive than any they'd shared before, Sarah presented Thomas with a gift. A new winter hat she'd sewn from rabbit fur he'd trapped, lined with soft fabric from her old petticoat. "You needn't have," he began. "We wanted to," Sarah interrupted. "All of us." Thomas accepted the gift awkwardly, unused to such gestures. From beneath his bed he retrieved 3 small packages, wrapped in clean deerskin and tied with sinew. "For children," he explained. Inside, Emma found a delicate wooden comb carved with flowering vines. James received a small bow with arrows tipped in soft leather, for safety. For baby Lucy, Thomas had fashioned a wooden rattle filled with the smallest glass beads, making a pleasant sound when shaken. "Did you make all these?" Sarah asked, watching her children's delighted faces. Thomas nodded. "During nights, when quiet." "But when did you sleep?" Sarah wondered. A rare hint of amusement touched Thomas's eyes. "Sleep enough." Later, as the children played with their gifts by candlelight, Sarah drew Thomas aside. "I have something else for you." She handed him a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Sarah's neat handwriting. "I've been recording your Apache remedies," she explained. "The herbs you use, their preparations, their purposes, so the knowledge won't be lost." Thomas ran his fingers over the pages, unexpectedly moved. His people's healing traditions preserved by this woman's hand. "Most precious gift," he said softly. "I've left many pages blank," Sarah added. "For you to add more, perhaps teach me in time." Thomas nodded, unable to express the fullness in his chest. Instead, he reached for his carving tools and a special piece of cedar he'd been saving. "Have gift for you too, not finished yet," Sarah smiled. "Then I look forward to tomorrow." That night, as the children slept beneath the soft glow of the decorated tree, Thomas worked by firelight, carving a small wooden box with intertwining designs, Apache symbols of protection blended with the roses Sarah had once described from her childhood garden in Pennsylvania. Outside, snow fell silently, isolating their cabin from the world beyond. Inside, warmth and light pushed back the darkness. Thomas paused in his carving, watching Sarah sleep, her face peaceful in the fire's glow. For the first time in decades, the winter solstice, his people's traditional time of reflection, found him not alone, not merely surviving, but somehow improbably living. January brought the worst blizzard in memory. For 3 days, wind howled around the cabin, snow piling against the walls until the windows were half buried. Thomas maintained constant vigilance, regularly clearing paths to the woodpile and checking his reinforcements against the cold. On the 4th morning, the storm briefly subsided, revealing a transformed landscape, familiar contours buried beneath pristine white. Thomas used the respite to check his nearby traps, leaving Sarah and the children with strict instructions to remain indoors. "The weather can change in minutes," he warned. "No wandering." James watched wistfully as Thomas strapped on snowshoes. "Can't I come? I've been inside forever." "Next time," Thomas promised. "Storm not finished yet." Sarah kept the children occupied with lessons and chores, but James grew increasingly restless. When she turned her attention to Lucy's midday feeding, she didn't notice her son slipping on his coat and boots. James intended only to practice with his Christmas bow in the clearing behind the cabin. But the fresh snow made the landscape unrecognizable, its familiar boundaries erased. Excited by his temporary freedom, he ventured further than planned, following what he thought was the path to the creek. The storm returned with frightening suddenness. One moment clear skies, the next a wall of white descending from the mountains. James turned to retrace his steps, but his tracks had already disappeared beneath fresh snow. Thomas, returning with 2 rabbits from his trapline, spotted the small boot prints leading away from the cabin. Cold dread settled in his stomach as he recognized their size. Dropping his game, he followed the trail with desperate focus, even as the blizzard rapidly obscured it. Inside the cabin, Sarah realized with horror that James was missing. She bundled the girls in blankets near the fire, panic rising as she searched every corner of their small home. "James!" she called futilely against the howling wind, standing in the doorway, unable to venture far with the younger children. An hour passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah alternated between braying at the window and comforting her frightened daughters. When the cabin door finally burst open, Thomas appeared carrying a small, still bundle. "James!" Sarah cried, rushing forward. The boy was conscious, but barely lips blue, extremities stiff with cold. Thomas moved with practiced efficiency, stripping off James's frozen clothes while instructing Sarah to heat water and gather blankets. Found me, James," stuttered through chattering teeth. How?" Apache tracker, Thomas said simply, rubbing the boy's limbs to restore circulation. Followed signs. As they worked to warm James, Thomas noticed his labored breathing, the wet, crackling sound a familiar harbinger of lung sickness. He'd seen it before in children exposed to winter's fury, knew its deadly potential. From beneath a floorboard, Thomas retrieved a weathered leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age and covered in faded script. Some entries were in English, others in Apache symbols, the collective medical wisdom of generations. This journal had been started by his grandmother, continued by his mother, and maintained by Thomas himself, a living record of healing knowledge. "Need medicines," he told Sarah, rapidly turning pages, "strong ones. For chest." Sarah gathered the herbs he indicated, dried mullein, pine resin, willow bark and others from his carefully maintained stores. Under Thomas's direction, she prepared poultices and teas while he monitored James's temperature and breathed. Through the night, they worked as partners, applying hot compresses, administering herbal remedies, taking turns, holding the feverish boy. Emma helped by caring for Lucy, displaying a maturity beyond her years as she sensed the gravity of the situation. Near dawn, James's fever spiked dangerously. His breathing became shallow, his small body burning despite their efforts. Sarah, exhausted and terrified, clutched Thomas's arm. "Is he going to die?" she whispered, voice breaking. Thomas met her gaze steadily. "Not if I can help it." He turned to a section of the healing journal marked with a red symbol. Remedies of last resort, powerful medicines used only in dire circumstances. The page detailed a complex preparation requiring precise measurements and specific timing. "Need your help," Thomas told Sarah. "Mixture dangerous if wrong. Must be exact." Together they worked with focused precision, Thomas directing while Sarah prepared the medicine according to the journal's instructions. When complete, Thomas lifted James's head gently. "Must drink all," he instructed the semi-conscious boy. "Medicine strong, might taste bad." James managed to swallow the bitter liquid before falling back into restless sleep. Thomas placed a hand on the boy's chest, feeling the struggle of each breath. "Now we wait," he said quietly. Sarah sank down beside him, beyond exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding him, for knowing what to do." Thomas shook his head slightly. "My fault. Should have watched closer." "You can't watch everyone every moment," Sarah countered. "And you found him when no one else could have." As the blizzard continued its assault outside, they maintained their vigil. Hours passed with agonizing slowness, marked only by the rhythm of James's labored breathing and the occasional need to administer more medicine. Near midnight, the fever finally broke. James's breathing eased, his sleep becoming more natural. Sarah wept silently with relief, her head dropping to Thomas's shoulder. Without thinking, his arm went around her, offering comfort in the shared exhaustion of their ordeal. "He will recover now," Thomas assured her. "Strong boy, fighter. Like someone else I know," Sarah murmured, her voice thick with fatigue and emotion. Thomas stiffened slightly at the comparison, but didn't withdraw his arm. They remained that way until dawn, connected in the aftermath of fear, their concerns, their relief, their care for the children binding them together more powerfully than any written agreement. When James woke the next morning, weak but alert, he found his mother asleep beside him and Thomas keeping watch nearby, the healing journal open on his lap, documenting the night's treatments in his careful hand, ensuring the knowledge that had saved the boy would be preserved for generations yet to come. February brought clearer skies and a gradual thawing of the deepest snowdrifts. James recovered slowly but completely, his adventure becoming a cautionary tale Thomas used in tracking lessons with both children. The family settled into comfortable rhythms, their initial awkwardness replaced by easy familiarity. One crisp morning, Thomas was teaching Emma and James to identify animal tracks in the snow when the distant sound of horses broke the stillness. He straightened immediately, senses alert. Inside, he instructed the children, "Find your mother." Thomas met the approaching riders at the edge of the clearing, positioning himself between them and the cabin. Sheriff Dawson led the group, accompanied by 2 deputies and, surprisingly, Judge Hammond from the county seat, identifiable by his formal eastern coat. "Eagle," the sheriff acknowledged with a curt nod. His polished badge caught the winter sunlight, gleaming with official authority. "Sheriff," Thomas replied evenly. "Judge." "Cold reception for the law," Dawson remarked, dismounting. "Especially when we've ridden all this way in winter." "State your business," Thomas said, remaining where he stood. Judge Hammond, a thin man with spectacles and an air of detached formality, stepped forward. "We're here about the Miller family. There have been concerns raised by prominent citizens. Sarah Miller and her children are here by choice," Thomas stated. "Have agreement signed, witnessed." From the cabin doorway, Sarah appeared. "Gentlemen," she called, approaching with measured steps. "To what do we owe this visit?" Sheriff Dawson touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Miller, Judge Hammond, has come all the way from Carson City to address the matter of your living arrangements." "I wasn't aware my living arrangements required judicial review," Sarah replied coolly. Judge Hammond cleared his throat. "Mrs. Miller, serious concerns have been raised regarding the welfare of your children. Living in such unusual circumstances, without proper schooling or Christian influence, my children are educated daily," Sarah interrupted. "I was a school teacher before my marriage. They receive lessons in reading, writing, mathematics and natural science, and other lessons, I imagine," one deputy muttered, with a pointed glance at Thomas. Thomas remained impassive, though Sarah's cheeks flushed with anger. "If you're implying something improper, deputy, have the courage to state it plainly," she challenged. Judge Hammond raised a placating hand. "Mrs. Miller, no one is suggesting impropriety, but surely you understand how unusual, how potentially harmful this situation appears. The only harm my children have faced came from being evicted from our home in town," Sarah countered, "while Miss Eagle provided shelter and protection when no one else would." Sheriff Dawson stepped closer, his badge catching the light as he moved. "Mrs. Miller, the judge has the authority to evaluate the suitability of homes for minor children. You're threatening to take my children." Sarah's voice rose slightly. "We're ensuring their welfare," the sheriff corrected smoothly. "The town council has expressed willingness to find you proper accommodations in Clearwater, with appropriate supervision." Supervision, Sarah echoed incredulously. I'm their mother, a widow living alone with an Indian man, Judge Hammond stated bluntly. It raises questions of moral fitness. At this, Thomas finally spoke. Our arrangement is proper. Separate quarters. Business partnership. For survival. The judge studied Thomas with clinical detachment. Even if that's true, Mr. Eagle, surely you understand that children need proper upbringing, Christian teachings, civilized influence. From inside the cabin, the door burst open, and James ran out, followed more hesitantly by Emma. You can't make us leave, James shouted, positioning himself beside Thomas. Mr. Eagle saved my life in the blizzard. He teaches us important things. James, Sarah cautioned, placing a restraining hand on his shoulder. Sheriff Dawson's expression softened slightly at the boy's outburst. Son, no decisions have been made. We're just talking. Emma moved to her mother's side. We want to stay here, she said quietly, but firmly. We're happy. Judge Hammond observed the scene with narrowed eyes. Sheriff, perhaps we should continue this discussion inside. It's quite cold for the children to be outdoors. Thomas nodded once toward the cabin. Welcome to our home, Judge. See for yourself how children live. Inside, the transformation of Thomas's once Spartan cabin was evident. Neat curtains hung at windows, children's drawings decorated walls, books and educational materials were organized on shelves. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the space with savory aromas. Judge Hammond took in these details with careful consideration, occasionally writing notes in a small book. He examined the children's lessons, questioned Sarah about their daily routines, and observed the clearly defined separate sleeping areas. You seem to have established orderly household, he conceded reluctantly. We have, Sarah agreed, different from town life certainly, but one where my children are thriving. The judge turned to Thomas. And your role, Mr. Eagle? Provider, protector, teacher of skills town doesn't value. The judge closed his notebook. Sheriff, I believe I've seen enough for today. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Dawson lingered, absently touching the badge on his chest, a habitual gesture Thomas had noticed before. This isn't over, Mrs. Miller, he said quietly. The judge may write his report, but the town has influence. There are laws about proper guardianship of children. We've broken no laws, Sarah insisted. Sometimes laws change to address unusual situations. The sheriff's meaning was clear. After the visitors departed, Sarah sank into a chair, tension visibly draining from her shoulders. They're going to try to take them, she whispered. Thomas stood by the window, watching the riders disappear into the trees. Won't let that happen, he said with quiet certainty. Emma approached, slipping her small hand into his. Are we in trouble, Mr. Eagle? Thomas looked down at the child's trusting face, then at Sarah and James. Something fierce and protective rose in his chest, a feeling deeper than obligation, stronger than their written agreement. No trouble, he assured her. Family stays together. The word family hung in the air, no longer a practical arrangement, but a declaration, one that would soon be tested more severely than any of them could anticipate. The general store in Clearwater had never seen such commotion. 2 tables had been set up, one near the entrance, the other by the pot-bellied stove, each bearing a document headed with bold script. Citizens entered, read both papers, and invariably signed one before departing with grim or satisfied expressions. Another signature for the protection of Christian values, announced Mrs. Porter, the Reverend's wife, as Mr. Wilson added his name to her petition. That makes 38 concerned citizens. From his table Dr. Anderson called, and 26 for respecting a mother's rights and recognizing true Christian charity. He nodded toward his own petition, which bore fewer signatures, but included several prominent names, including 2 town council members. The competing petitions had circulated for a week since Judge Hammond's visit to Thomas's cabin. News had spread quickly through town. dividing Clearwater along unexpected lines. Some, like Reverend Porter, cited moral outrage and concern for the children's spiritual welfare. Others, particularly those who remembered Thomas's help during the influenza epidemic, questioned the justice of separating a family that by all accounts was thriving. "This isn't about prejudice," insisted Mrs. Wilson to a customer examining both petitions. "It's about proper upbringing. Those children need civilized influence." "Seems to me," countered Mrs. Taylor, the blacksmith's wife, "that forcing children from their mother is hardly civilized." She signed Dr. Anderson's petition with a flourish. Outside the store, Sarah tied her horse to the hitching post, straightening her best dress nervously. This was her first return to Clearwater since fleeing months ago. Thomas had objected strongly to her coming alone, but Sarah had insisted, "They need to see me as a respectable mother, not a woman hiding behind an Apache," she'd explained. "Besides, you need to stay with the children." Thomas had finally relented, but only after teaching her to use his pistol and insisting she return before dusk. Heads turned as Sarah entered the store, conversations halting abruptly. She stood tall, meeting the stares with dignity. "Good morning," she greeted calmly. "I've come for supplies." Mrs. Porter recovered first. "Well, if it isn't Mrs. Miller, finally remembered civilization exists." Sarah ignored the barb, moving to the counter where Mr. Wilson waited uncomfortably. "I need flour, sugar, coffee, and fabric for the children's spring clothes, please." As Wilson gathered her items, Sarah noticed the two tables with their competing documents. Dr. Anderson beckoned her over. "Mrs. Miller, you should see this." He handed her his petition. Sarah read it slowly, emotion tightening her throat. The document eloquently defended her right to determine her family's living arrangements, praised Thomas Eagle's character based on his past service to the town, and requested the judge dismiss any action to separate the children from their mother. 26 signatures, she murmured, recognizing several from prominent citizens. "Would have been more," Anderson said quietly, "but some fear retribution from the Reverend's faction." Sarah turned to the opposing petition, which Mrs. Porter pointedly moved away from her reach. "That document," Mrs. Porter declared loudly, "requests Judge Hammond remove those poor children from an unsuitable environment and place them with proper Christian guardians until you come to your senses." A murmur passed through the store. Sarah straightened her shoulders. "Those poor children are thriving," she stated clearly. "They're educated daily. They're learning practical skills for frontier life. They're loved and protected. By an Indian, someone muttered. By a man who has shown more Christian charity than many who attend church every Sunday," Sarah countered. "When my family was homeless, Thomas Eagle opened his door. When my baby was sick, his medicine healed her. When my son was lost in a blizzard, he tracked and found him." Mrs. Porter sniffed dismissively. "No one denies the savage has some useful skills, but proper moral guidance." "His name," Sarah interrupted firmly, "is Thomas Eagle, and he has taught my children more about honor, respect, and true morality than they ever learned in town." The store fell silent. Sarah returned to the counter, paid for her purchases, and turned to leave. At the door she paused. "I was born in this territory. I've lived by its rules my entire life, but if those rules now say a mother can be separated from her children for choosing safety and kindness over prejudice, perhaps they deserve to be challenged." Outside, Sarah found Dr. Anderson had followed her. "Brave words," he said, helping her load her purchases, "but dangerous ones." "What choice do I have?" Sarah asked. "They're trying to take my children." Anderson handed her a sealed envelope. "Judge Hammond's preliminary ruling. He's allowing the children to remain with you for now, but has scheduled a formal hearing next month. All parties must attend. All parties, you, the children, and Thomas." Sarah's heart sank. "They'll never give him a fair hearing." "Perhaps not," Anderson agreed grimly, "but public opinion is more divided than Reverend Porter expected. Your family has supporters, Mrs. Miller. Not enough, according to those petitions. Numbers aren't everything. Judge Hammond values reason, and law over popular sentiment. Present your case well, and you may prevail." As Sarah mounted her horse, Andon added, "Mrs. Miller, there's talk of another solution, one that might satisfy legal concerns while allowing your family to remain together." "What solution?" "Marriage," Anderson said simply. "A legal union would establish Thomas as the children's stepfather and remove many objections." Sarah's cheeks flushed. We haven't discussed. Consider it," Anderson advised. Before the hearing, Sarah rode home, lost in thought, the competing petitions weighing on her mind. One document sought to destroy what she'd found with Thomas. The other defended it. Both represented the community's judgment on their unconventional family. As she approached the cabin, she saw Thomas chopping wood while the children gathered kindling nearby. They worked together with the easy coordination of a family long united, not one formed from necessity months ago. Thomas set down his axe when he spotted her, concern evident in his expression, until she smiled reassuringly. The children ran to greet her, chattering excitedly about their day. Later, after the children were asleep, Sarah showed Thomas the judge's letter and described the dueling petitions. "Anderson says we have supporters in town," she concluded. "Not as many as our opponents, but influential ones." Thomas listened silently, his expression unreadable. Finally he asked, "What happens at hearing?" "Judge Hammond will decide whether I'm a fit mother," Sarah explained, her voice catching. "Whether our home is suitable for raising children." "Our home," Thomas repeated, the significance of her phrasing not lost on him. "What can we do?" Sarah hesitated, then shared Anderson's suggestion. Thomas's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, the most surprise she'd ever seen him display. "Marriage," he echoed. "To satisfy white man's law?" "To keep our family together," Sarah corrected softly. Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Would you want such a thing, beyond necessity?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Sarah found herself unable to meet his gaze. "I want my children safe," she answered, carefully. "I want this home we've built together." Thomas nodded once, accepting her indirect response. "We'll consider all options before hearing," he promised. "Find way to keep family together." That night, Sarah lay awake long after Thomas had retired to his separate sleeping area. The word marriage echoed in her mind, a practical solution to their legal problem, yet carrying implications neither had been ready to voice aloud. Their partnership had evolved from necessity to friendship, to something deeper, yet still undefined. Outside, an owl called into the night. Inside, a family slept beneath one roof, their future hanging in the balance between two petitions in a distant town, one seeking to tear them apart, the other fighting to let them remain whole. The official document arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a nervous young deputy who seemed relieved to hand it over and depart quickly. Thomas accepted the sealed envelope with a stoic nod, bringing it inside where Sarah was teaching the children arithmetic. "From town," he said simply, placing it on the table. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside was a formal notice, bearing the territorial court stamp and Judge Hammond's signature. The legal language was dense, but its message unmistakable. "Hereby order Sarah Miller to present herself and minor children Emma Miller, age 10, James Miller, age 7, and Lucy Miller, age 1, before the territorial court on April 15th to determine fitness of current guardianship arrangements. Failure to appear will result in immediate removal of said minors to territorial custody pending permanent placement with suitable Christian guardians." Sarah read it twice, her face paling. "1 week," she whispered. "They're giving us 1 week to comply." Thomas took the document, studying it carefully. "Says you must present yourself and children. Doesn't mention me." "Of course not," Sarah said bitterly. "They don't consider you part of this family, despite everything." She looked up suddenly. "But you are. The children need you there." Thomas nodded once. "We'll come, though presence may harm case." "I don't care," Sarah insisted. We face this together. Emma approached cautiously, sensing the tension. What's wrong, Mama? Sarah hesitated, then knelt to her daughter's level. We need to go to town next week. The judge wants to talk to us about our living arrangements. With Mr. Eagle? James asked, joining them. Yes, Sarah confirmed. Some people in town don't understand our family. James's face clouded. They want to separate us, don't they? Thomas and Sarah exchanged surprised glances at the boy's perception. We won't let that happen, Sarah assured him, though uncertainty edged her voice. That evening, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Sarah sat by the fire, the legal notice lying between them like a physical threat. Dr. Anderson suggested we have options, Sarah began hesitantly. Thomas nodded. Marriage. To satisfy law. It would establish you as the children's legal stepfather, Sarah explained. Make our arrangement respectable in their eyes. Thomas stared into the flames. Would be false reason for sacred bond. False? Sarah's voice caught slightly. Thomas met her gaze. Marriage should be from heart, not fear. Sarah looked away, unable to respond. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken feelings. There are other options, Thomas finally said. Could leave territory, start new elsewhere. Running away, protecting family, he corrected gently. Sarah shook her head. I won't be driven from our home. The children are settled here. As she hesitated, it feels like surrendering to their prejudice. Thomas considered this. Could fight in court. Dr. Anderson would speak for us. Others too, perhaps. Against the Reverend, the sheriff, and half the town. Sarah's voice held little hope, and even if Judge Hammond ruled in our favor, the town would never truly accept us. Don't need town's acceptance, Thomas observed. Have survived without it 20 years. But the children need community, Sarah countered. Friends, education, a future. Have community here, Thomas insisted quietly. Small but strong, Sarah reached impulsively for his hand, a gesture that had become more natural in recent months. I know we do, but is it enough for them, for their future? Thomas's hand remained steady in hers. What do you want, Sarah? He asked directly. Beyond children's safety. The question hung between them. The first time he had asked about her personal desires rather than practical needs. I want, Sarah began, then faltered. I want what we've built here. This home. This life. She met his eyes. This family, including you. Thomas's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in his eyes. Marriage would protect children legally, he said carefully. But what of after? When danger passes? What do you mean? Marriage is binding, he explained. If later, you wish different life, understanding dawned on Sarah's face. You think I would change my mind? See this as temporary? Thomas looked away. White woman with Apache husband. Difficult life. Many hardships. Thomas, Sarah said softly, using his given name with the familiarity that had gradually developed between them. These past months have been the hardest of my life. Homeless, struggling, facing prejudice and legal threats. Yet they've also brought me more peace, more purpose than I've known since before Richard died. She squeezed his hand. Because of you, because of what we've built together. Thomas's eyes met hers, searching for certainty. If we marry, Sarah continued, it wouldn't be just for legal protection. It would be because we've already become a family in every way that matters. Every way? Thomas asked. The question weighted with meaning. Sarah's cheeks colored slightly, but she held his gaze. We've shared a home, raised children together, faced threats together. We've become partners in every sense, except one. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, spring peepers had begun their evening chorus, signaling the change of season. Would need to decide quickly, Thomas finally said. Before court date. Sarah nodded, understanding the practical reality behind his words. Whatever we decide, we have 1 week to prepare. Thomas rose and moved to the window, staring out at the darkening forest. Could lose everything, he said quietly. Home, children, you. Sarah joined him, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. Or we could gain everything, she countered softly. A true family, recognized by law if not by everyone in town. Marriage wouldn't change prejudice, Thomas warned. No, Sarah agreed, but it would change our legal standing, and, she hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty, it would acknowledge what I think we've both felt for some time. Thomas turned to her, his usual stoic expression softened by something Sarah had glimpsed only rarely, vulnerability, hope, and a question he couldn't quite voice. Think on it, Sarah said gently. We have a few days yet. As they prepared for sleep in their separate areas, the legal notice remained on the table, its cold, formal language, a stark contrast to the warm, complicated feelings that had finally been acknowledged between them. Dawn broke clear on the day of the hearing. Thomas rose earlier than usual, moving with deliberate purpose. From a small buckskin pouch he kept beneath his bed, he withdrew something he hadn't worn in 20 years, a silver medallion on a leather cord engraved with symbols of his lineage and clan. His father had placed it around his neck when Thomas was 16, marking his passage to manhood. After years of prejudice and isolation, Thomas had stopped wearing it publicly, keeping this piece of his heritage hidden like so much else. Today would be different. Sarah found him standing before the small mirror, the medallion resting against his chest. She paused, recognizing the significance without needing explanation. It's beautiful, she said softly. Family symbol, Thomas explained. Father's line. Grandfather was medicine man, grandmother was tribal elder's daughter. He turned to face her. Haven't worn it since coming to this valley. Why today? Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer. Time to remember who I am, Thomas said simply, not hide anymore. Their gazes held, an understanding passing between them that transcended words. 3 days of careful consideration had led to this moment, not just the medallion, but the decision it represented. I've told the children to wear their best clothes, Sarah said. Emma is helping James polish his boots. Thomas nodded approvingly. We'll hitch wagon after breakfast. The meal was quieter than usual, each family member absorbed in private thoughts. Even Lucy seemed to sense the day's importance, sitting solemnly in her high chair. As they prepared to leave, Thomas touched Sarah's arm. Whatever happens today, he said quietly, proud to stand with you, with our family. Sarah's eyes glistened. Our family, she repeated. The words a confirmation. The journey to town took nearly 2 hours. As they approached Clearwater, Thomas felt the familiar tension that always accompanied his rare visits. But today it was different. Today he wasn't coming to trade quietly and leave unnoticed. Today he would stand publicly with Sarah and the children, not as a silent guardian, but as a man claiming his place in their family. The territorial courthouse occupied the largest building in Clearwater. As their wagon approached, Thomas noted the crowd gathered outside, nearly half the town, it seemed. Conversations halted, as people turned to stare. They're all watching, Emma whispered nervously. Let them, Sarah replied, straightening her shoulders. We have nothing to be ashamed of. Thomas guided the wagon to the hitching post. Before helping Sarah down, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable months ago. He removed his worn hat, revealing his long black hair neatly tied back, and squared his shoulders, letting the silver medallion catch the sunlight. Then he stepped down from the wagon, turned, and extended his hand to Sarah in full view of the townspeople. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Thomas ignored it, focusing instead on Sarah's face as she placed her hand in his, and descended from the wagon with dignity. He then helped each child down, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Together, they walked toward the courthouse steps. The crowd parted reluctantly, some turning away, others staring openly. Thomas felt James's small hand slip into his, while Emma pressed close to Sarah, who carried Lucy. At the courthouse entrance, Sheriff Dawson waited, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Miller, he acknowledged. Then after a pause, Mr. Eagle. Inside, the courtroom was already crowded. Reverend Porter and his supporters occupied the front rows. Dr. Anderson and several others rose as they entered, a silent show of support. Judge Hammond sat at the bench, observing their entrance with clinical interest. "Mrs. Miller," he called, "please approach with your household." Sarah moved forward confidently, the children and Thomas following. They stood before the bench, a united front. "I see Mr. Eagle has chosen to join us," the judge noted. "As a member of our family, Your Honor," Sarah replied clearly. "We face this together." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. And what precisely is Mr. Eagle's role in your household, Mrs. Miller?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Thomas Eagle has been my partner in raising these children for the past 6 months. He has provided for us, protected us, taught the children valuable skills, and helped them thrive." "A business arrangement," the judge pressed. "It began that way," Sarah acknowledged, "but has become much more." Reverend Porter rose from his seat. "Your Honor, this is precisely our concern. This relationship is inappropriate and harmful to the children's moral development." "I would like to hear from the children themselves," Judge Hammond decided. "Emma Miller, please step forward." Emma approached the bench, her face solemn but composed. "Young lady," the judge began gently, "are you happy in your current home?" "Yes, sir," Emma answered, without hesitation. "And Mr. Eagle, how does he treat you and your siblings?" Emma glanced back at Thomas, drawing strength from the sight of his medallion catching the light. "He teaches us things, sir. Important things about surviving in the wilderness, about respecting nature and animals. He never raises his voice, even when James is being difficult. He carved me a beautiful comb for Christmas." She paused, then added with childish certainty, "He loves us, sir, even if he doesn't say it." A soft murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hammond turned to James, who stepped forward without being called. "Mr. Eagle saved my life," the boy declared before being questioned. "I got lost in the blizzard, and he found me and made special medicine when I got sick. He's teaching me to be a man like him, honorable and brave." Lucy, hearing her siblings speak, began squirming in Sarah's arms, reaching toward Thomas. Without thinking, he took the baby, who settled contentedly against his chest, one small hand reaching up to grasp his medallion. The simple gesture, Thomas holding Lucy with natural ease, the child's obvious comfort with him, spoke more eloquently than any testimony. Judge Hammond observed them thoughtfully. "Mrs. Miller, I understand there may be a development in your situation." Sarah squared her shoulders. "Yes, Your Honor. Thomas and I have decided to marry." The announcement caused an uproar. Reverend Porter's voice rose above the others. "This is an abomination. A white woman cannot marry an Indian." "Actually, Reverend," Dr. Anderson interrupted, standing, "there is no territorial law prohibiting such a union. Uncommon, yes, but not illegal." Judge Hammond banged his gavel for order. "Mrs. Miller, Mr. Eagle, is this decision made freely, without coercion?" Thomas stepped forward, his medallion gleaming against his simple dark shirt. "Choose this family," he stated firmly. "Choose Sarah as wife, these children as my own, not from fear, from heart." It was the longest public statement many in the town had ever heard from the normally silent Apache. The simplicity and sincerity of his words seemed to hang in the air. Sarah moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "We choose each other, Your Honor. We are already a family in all the ways that matter. We merely ask for the legal recognition that will protect our children." Judge Hammond studied them for a long moment, the proud Apache man with the baby in his arms, the determined mother, the protective children. His gaze lingered on Thomas's medallion, understanding its significance. "I will consider all testimony and render my decision tomorrow," he announced finally. "This court is adjourned until then." As they left the courthouse, Thomas felt lighter than he had in decades. Whatever the judge decided, he had finally stood publicly as himself, not the silent, invisible Indian the town preferred to ignore, but a man with heritage, family, and purpose, the silver medallion against his chest catching the sunlight like a beacon. Spring sunshine streamed through the cabin windows, illuminating the newest addition to their home. A large table Thomas had crafted from pine and cedar, its surface smooth from days of careful sanding, its legs carved with intertwining patterns that merged Apache symbols with simple frontier designs. Sarah traced the intricate carvings with her fingertips. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "When did you find time to make this?" "Nights," Thomas replied. "After children asleep." He hesitated, then added, "Family needs proper table." 6 weeks had passed since Judge Hammond's ruling. To everyone's surprise, the judge had not only affirmed Sarah's custody of her children, but had officially recognized her right to determine their living arrangements without interference. His written decision had cited the children's obvious well-being, the stable home environment, and most surprisingly, the territory's founding principle of individual liberty. Today marked another milestone. Dr. Anderson would arrive soon to perform a small wedding ceremony, formalizing the commitment Thomas and Sarah had already made in their hearts. "Mama, is my hair all right?" Emma called, emerging from behind the curtain that sectioned off the girls' sleeping area. She wore her best dress, freshly ironed, with wildflowers woven into her braids. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Sarah assured her, adjusting the flowers. "James, are you ready?" The boy appeared, unusually tidy in his Sunday clothes, though his collar already showed signs of being tugged at impatiently. "Mr. Eagle, will I still call you that after today, or something else?" Thomas considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Your choice," he said finally. "Father still watches from above." He pointed skyward, acknowledging Richard Miller's memory. "Room in heart for both." James nodded solemnly. "I think Papa would understand." Outside, horses approached. Thomas moved to the window, relaxed when he recognized Dr. Anderson's buggy, accompanied by several riders, the handful of townspeople who had supported them throughout their ordeal. The ceremony itself was simple. Dr. Anderson, empowered as a justice of the peace, spoke briefly about commitment and family, before Sarah and Thomas exchanged their promises. Thomas had practiced his vows carefully, wanting his usually sparse words to fully express his feelings. Sarah's eyes glistened as he spoke of finding home, not in a place but in her, and the children. When they were pronounced husband and wife, Thomas took Sarah's hand with a gentleness that belied his calloused palms. The small gathering applauded, and Emma surprised everyone by releasing 2 butterflies she had carefully caught that morning. "One for each of you coming together," she explained. Later, their guests gathered around the new table for a wedding feast. The spread reflected their blended lives, Sarah's traditional recipes, alongside dishes Thomas had taught her from his heritage. Dr. Anderson raised a toast to the newlyweds, speaking eloquently about courage and new beginnings. Surprisingly, Sheriff Dawson arrived late in the celebration, alone and looking uncomfortable. He removed his hat at the door, nodded respectfully to Sarah and Thomas. "Mrs. Eagle," he acknowledged, using Sarah's new name for the first time. "Mr. Eagle, I come with news from town." The gathering quieted, tension returning. Thomas stood protectively near Sarah. "Reverend Porter and his wife have departed Clearwater," the sheriff announced. "Accepted a position at a church back east. Left yesterday." A collective release of breath rippled through the room. The Porters had been the most vocal opponents of their union, threatening continued legal challenges despite the judge's ruling. "The town council met this morning," Dawson continued, "voted to officially recognize your marriage and extend full rights of citizenship." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Also voted to acknowledge Mr. Eagle's contribution during the epidemic of '68. Belatedly." Thomas's expression remained impassive, but Sarah felt his hand tighten slightly around hers. "Thank you for bringing this news, Sheriff," she said graciously. "Would you join us for the celebration?" Dawson hesitated, then nodded. Just briefly, as the afternoon progressed, the cabin filled with conversation and occasional laughter. Thomas observed the scene with quiet amazement. His home, once a place of solitude, now transformed into the center of a small but genuine community. After their guests departed, The family gathered around their new table for a simple supper. Sarah had placed a candle at its center, its warm light illuminating the faces Thomas had come to love. "First meal as official family," he observed, the hint of a smile touching his usually solemn features. Emma raised her cup of milk. "To our family." James and Sarah joined the toast enthusiastically. Even Lucy babbled from her high chair, banging a wooden spoon. Later, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Sarah stood on the porch, watching twilight settle over their land. New spring growth was visible everywhere, the expanded garden, the beginnings of a proper barn, saplings planted to one day provide fruit. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, leaning against his shoulder. Thomas considered the question, his arms settling around her waist, thinking of time, how it changes. "For the better, I hope." He nodded, the medallion at his throat catching the last light of day. 20 years alone, thought that was my path. Now, he gestured toward the cabin, where their children slept. Different path. Better one. Sarah's hand found his. "I never imagined this life either. When Richard died, I thought our story was ending. I never dreamed of." She paused, searching for words. "Second chances," Thomas supplied. "Yes, for both of us." As darkness deepened, they remained on the porch, watching the first stars appear. Inside, the new table stood as testament to their union. Not just the joining of two people, but the blending of traditions, the building of something new and enduring from separate pasts. Years later, when grandchildren gathered around that same table to hear stories of the past, Thomas, his hair now streaked with silver, but his back still straight with dignity, would trace the carved patterns with weathered fingers and tell of a time when a lonely Apache and a desperate young mother discovered that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that love could bridge even the widest divides.